Hello, everyone. Hello, colleagues, compañeros, compañeras, compas. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our first fall 2022 bu.edu speaker series, Abolishing Carceral Social Work, the Child Welfare System, with Dean Alan Dettlaff. My name is Dawn Belkin-Martinez, and I am the Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion and co-chair, along with Ellen Duveau, of our BUSSW E&I committee, which includes all of our stakeholders, faculty, staff, students, administrators, and alumni. The committee has been around for many years, engaging in the work of building equity, inclusion, and justice here at BUSSW, as well as amplifying social justice-focused activities in the community. Some of the work that we have engaged in includes organizing social justice learning communities, creating social justice-focused case consultations, partnering with different departments around social justice-focused interventions, student support and solidarity circles, and a field department social justice seminar. We have a wonderful resource page available to anyone that includes podcasts, peer-reviewed literature, and media articles that I encourage everyone to check out. Finally, we have a 3-hour online module on structural and institutional racism, again, available to anyone in the world. You can access many of these resources at our Equity and Inclusion webpage. I am going to briefly review our format today. I will introduce Dean Detloff, and he will present for between 30 and 40 minutes. We will then have 3 members of our BUSSW community offer a 1-minute reflection about the talk and ask Dean Detloff a question. Finally, we will be able to answer a few questions from the audience that you can type into the chat. Before we begin, I would like to review a few Zoom housekeeping items. Anyone who is receiving CEUs will need to keep their camera on during the entire presentation. If you are not receiving CEUs, we recommend turning off your camera during Dean Detloff's presentation. If you are receiving CEUs, you will need to complete the evaluation form. We will type the link to the evaluation form in the chat at the end of the presentation. We suggest having your Zoom settings on speaker's view. We will be recording the presentation, so if you aren't comfortable being recorded and you aren't receiving CEUs, please keep your camera off during the speaker's presentation. We will be posting the recording on our E&I speaker series page a few days after the talk. All participants will be muted during the presentation. Please do not use the chat during Dean Detloff's presentation, as that can be distracting for the speaker. Closed captioning is available for this event through a stream text link that will be added into the chat. You can also access closed captioning through Zoom. If joining by computer, click on the live transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Once you click on live transcript, please then click enable to start the closed captioning. If you are joining by phone, go to settings, meetings, and then closed caption. Finally, it goes without saying that all comments in the chat should be respectful and mindful of our entire BUSSW community. We would like to begin our presentation with a land acknowledgement. A land acknowledgement reminds us that colonialization is an enduring reality and that Boston University sits on the stolen lands of the Massachusetts people. If you're outside of Boston, take some time to learn about the tribal lands where you live and the ongoing movements to have land honored, acknowledged, and returned. This year has been challenging in so many ways these past few years. With COVID-19 unmasking the devastating long-term effects of racial capitalism, transphobia, classism, and gender inequality, the timing of Dean Dettlaff's talk couldn't be more appropriate for our historical moment when we, as social workers, part of our world community, stand at a crossroad. The child welfare system in its current state disproportionately harms Black, Indigenous, and Latinx children and families through systemic surveillance, separation, and the adverse outcomes associated with family separation and foster care. Ending this harm will only be achieved when the forcible separation of children from their parents is no longer viewed as an acceptable form of intervention. In this E&I Speaker Series event, we will discuss the movement to abolish the child welfare system and the broader need for social work profession to align its practices with its stated values and ethical principles. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Alan Detloff, is the Dean of the Graduate School of Social Work at the University of Houston and the inaugural Maconda Brown O'Connor Endowed Dean's Chair. Prior to entering academia, Dean Dettlaff worked in the child welfare system as a caseworker and an administrator. He received his bachelor's degree in social work from TCU and master's in social work and PhD from the University of Texas at Arlington. Dean Dettlaff's work focuses on addressing and eliminating the impacts of structural and institutional racism on Black children and other children of color impacted by child welfare system intervention. He is the co-founder of the Up-End movement, a collaborative movement that seeks to end the involuntary separation of children from their parents through the abolition of foster care and the child welfare system. I have been fortunate enough to hear Dean Dettlaff speak several times. We use his work in our classes here at BUSSW, and I always learn something new each time. Please join me in welcoming our BUSSW Equity and Inclusion speaker and my comrade in the struggle for justice, Dean Alan Dettlaff.
Thank you very much, Dawn, and thank you for the invitation to be part of your speaker series. It's really an honor for me to be invited, and I'm looking forward to talking with you all tonight and hearing from the respondents as well as answering some of your questions. I'll give a little bit more of a background before we start the formal presentation just on my time in the child welfare system, which I now refer to as the family policing system, because I believe that more adequately captures the roles that the system plays in the lives of children and families. I worked in the system for about 7 years, and during that time, my role in the system was as a child maltreatment investigator. So it was my role to investigate families for alleged allegations of abuse, and then it was my role to forcibly separate children and families. So for 5 to 6 years, I was responsible for the forced separation of many families, and I worked in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. And it wasn't until I left the system that I came to understand the problem of the overrepresentation of Black children and other children of color in the system. It wasn't until I left the system that I understand how harmful forcible family separation is on children and families. And that really began my journey of understanding my own complicity in contributing to harm in the system, and brought about eventually my understanding of the need to abolish the system. I spent many years working towards reforms and ultimately realized that those were never going to achieve the end result that I and many others now think we need to achieve. So we'll get to that in the presentation. I'm going to start to share some slides here. So I'll be talking today, as Dawn mentioned, about the movement to abolish the child welfare system, and then bring that into more of a bigger picture sense of what I think is social work's responsibility more broadly in the abolitionist space. So to start off with an overview of what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to kind of review what we know about the racist inequities that exist in the system. And then we're going to talk about the harm that results from those inequities, specifically the disproportionate harm that results primarily to Black and Indigenous children. We'll talk about what the up-in movement is, why I and many others believe that abolition is the only solution to ending the harm of that system. And then, as I said, we're going to frame abolition of the family policing system just as one part of a much broader movement within social work and outside of social work to fully abolish carceral systems more broadly, including things like prisons and the police. So to get us started in terms of framing this issue of what we're talking about, much of the movement to abolish the family policing system or the child welfare system starts with the concept of racial disproportionality, which is a concept that's been termed by the state to describe the overrepresentation of mostly Black children in the child welfare system. I'll show you a chart on that in just a second so you can see the extent of that. But the important thing to understand about racial disproportionality is that it has been observed in the child welfare system for over 60 years. The modern child welfare system started in around the 1960s, and the overrepresentation of Black children in that system has been present since the very beginning of that system. So this isn't a problem that the child welfare system is unaware of or has not tried to address before. But there's been, primarily within academic spaces, a lot of debate about the causes of disproportionality. And that debate has resulted in a lot of confusion in the field and many efforts to address disproportionality that were much more active, I'd say, around the 2000s, between like 2000 and 2010. Much of that has stalled in recent years. And so what we've known has been a problem literally for decades just continues to be unresolved. The real issue with disproportionality, though, is that this disproportionate involvement that has been unaddressed for 60 years causes disproportionate harm, and the system has systematically failed to address that harm. That's why I and many others think we need to be looking at different solutions to this problem. So to give you a sense here of what disproportionality looks like, you can see that Black children are represented in the blue bar at the bottom. Black children are about 15% of the child population in the United States, and they represent about 25% of children in care. So at a rate at about 1.7 times their proportion in the general population. This number's gone down some since the height of disproportionality in 2000, but you can see after decades of trying to address this problem, it still persists. And you can see that this is different if we look at white children, which are the green bar, or if we look at Latinx children, which are the purple bar. You can see that they're underrepresented in the system. In Massachusetts, it mirrors this rate. In Massachusetts, Black children are overrepresented at about 1.6 times their proportion of the population. But if you were to look at this at every state, every single state in the United States, Black children are consistently overrepresented. There are some states where Indigenous children are overrepresented. Some states have virtually no population of Indigenous children at all. There are about 10 to 15 states where Latinx children are overrepresented, but it varies widely by geography. Black children are the only population that are consistently overrepresented in every state in the country. And then just briefly, racial disproportionality exists because of disparities, racial disparities that happen at these different entry points and exit points from the system. And at every point, if you start at the very beginning place when calls are made to a child welfare hotline, Black children are overrepresented in those hotline calls. They're overrepresented in confirmed cases of maltreatment. They're significantly overrepresented in children who are forcibly separated from their homes and placed in foster care. And then once they're in foster care, Black children are less likely to exit to reunification and more likely to spend time in foster care. In a minute, we'll talk about why that happens. But it's important to know here that this is not a debated phenomenon. The data on disproportionality are very clear that these disparities exist. And again, that has been known by the system for decades now. When we talk about why racial disproportionality and disparities exist, I think it's important to start by talking about the history of the child welfare system and the history of racism within the child welfare system. And if we start here at the very beginning, this is the history of the modern child welfare system. This often goes unrecognized, but Black children have been separated from their families by the state for over 400 years in the United States, beginning during the time of human chattel slavery. When slavery was abolished, the version of separations that happened during slavery and the other mechanisms of slavery that were meant for the purpose of maintaining the subjugation of Black Americans and the supremacy of white Americans simply morphed into other forms. But slavery, this is the origins of the modern child welfare system. And then we could see, we don't have time to go in detail about each of these policies, but what we see happen in the history of the United States and the history of the child welfare system is that once slavery was abolished, the white elite in society created laws and policies to essentially replicate a system of forced labor that was now lost through abolition of slavery. So through the Black codes, through Jim Crow laws that were deemed constitutional until the 1960s, not that long ago, through implementation of the GI Bill, through racial residential segregation, the United States, since the abolition of slavery, has systematically passed laws and policies for the purpose of recreating slavery as much as possible through not only forced separation of children from their parents through indentured servitude, but also through the Black codes, Jim Crow laws, by recreating classifications of crime to result in the over-arrest and over-incarceration of Black Americans to serve again as a source of forced labor through what's commonly called chain gangs. We see this in the child welfare system too. The earliest origins of the child welfare system, the Social Security Act, which established aid for dependent children, which later became AFDC, Aid for Families with Dependent Children, and now TANF. Aid for dependent children was passed for the exclusive purpose of providing financial benefits to white widowed mothers so that they could stay in their homes with their children when the father in the home, when the man in the home was either dead or incapacitated at some point. It wasn't created for all families. Once Black families started to access welfare benefits, those families were systematically denied those benefits through what you probably heard of, things like man in the house clauses or other unsuitable home clauses that denied Black families access to those services. Then we get to the Fleming Rule of the 1960s that outlawed the use of those unsuitability clauses, but that said that if a caseworker, an AFDC worker, deemed a home to be unsuitable, rather than denying them benefits, they needed to be taken into foster care. And that's what began racial disproportionality in the early 1960s. So then we see this influx of Black children in homes that were deemed unsuitable. 81% of the children who were in foster care in 1961 were in foster care because they were living in what was classified either a broken home or in an illegitimate home where there were not married parents. Fast forward to the CAPTA, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, that established mandatory reporting that resulted in significant harms for Black children, and then the Adoption and Safe Families Act. All of these acts, before they were passed, people often talk about unintended consequences of CAPTA and ASFA. Before CAPTA and ASFA were passed, there was a volume of data, information, that showed that should those laws be passed, they would be significantly harmful to Black children and families. The legislators of that time decided that that was okay. They passed those laws anyways, and then we saw those harmful consequences become reality. So if you know that something's going to disproportionately harm Black children, you do it anyways, and then you see those harms realized, that's not an unintentional consequence. Those are intentional consequences to Black children and families that have been built into the system from its earliest origins. That's what I mean by the racist history of the system. But then we also see these things happening outside of the system as a result of those laws and policies, as a result of the Black codes, Jim Crow laws, the legacy of slavery, and the legacy of racism in this country during the time of slavery that extends through today. What we see is that Black children and families are more likely to be living in poverty, less likely to achieve higher educational levels. And we see that the stress of racism results in not only significant consequences to people's mental health, but also significant consequences to their physical health. A concept developed by another scientist called weathering shows that the daily impact of racism on Black Americans significantly contributes to breaking down their physical health over time. So poverty, health, mental health, and then these geographic issues, racial residential segregation, discrimination in housing, concentrated poverty, mass criminalization, all of these things exist to make it more likely that Black children and families are going to come to the attention of the child welfare system. And then once they get in the system, we see how racism plays out there. There are many studies that show evidence of racial bias in the system. I'm just going to talk briefly about one that I was involved in my early days working in Texas. In Texas, we did a large statewide study to look at whether and why racial disparities existed at 2 points of intervention, the substantiation decision and whether or not children needed to be removed from their families or not. What was unique about this study is that we were able to control for both income levels and caseworkers' assessment of risk. What we found is that when controlling for poverty and risk, so everything else being equal, Black children were 15% more likely than white children to be involved in a substantiated case. And among all maltreated children, just taking children deemed to be maltreated by the system, Black children were 20% more likely than white children to be involved in a case that was necessary to be opened for services. And of those cases, Black children were 77% more likely than white children to be forcibly separated from their families in lieu of receiving in-home services. And the only factor explaining this difference, 77% is a lot. The only factor explaining this difference was the race of the child. That's evidence of racism operating within the system to result in different decisions being made. Related to the issue of why I think it's important to call the system the family policing system, because that is more accurate, the child welfare system is the language we were given by the state. The state also gave us the concept of racial disproportionality and racial disparities. I think that those minimize the role of racism in contributing to this outcomes. So I think the term that we should be using to describe this is racist inequities, because that better amplifies the racism that's behind these outcomes. This isn't just a passive outcome. Black children aren't overrepresented in the system through unintentional consequences. They're overrepresented in the system through intentional policies that have been put in place in the system, and they're overrepresented in the system because intentional decision-making that's made when those policies are implemented. So racist inequities better describes the phenomenon that's existed in the child welfare system for decades. I'll talk briefly here about why this is important and why we should all care about this. I mean, one, the answer is because it's racist. That's why we should care about it. But then to go deeper than that, we know that this disproportionate involvement in the system causes disproportionate harm. Think about what we know about family separation. Now, think about the national outrage that existed a few years ago when families were being separated at the US-Mexico border. The pain and trauma that you all saw on TV when children were forcibly separated from their mother's arms at the border, that's the same pain and trauma that is happening all around us every day within the system. Children are separated by the family policing system. The number of children separated by that system every week matches the number of children that were separated by the Trump administration during this crisis in 2018. The family policing system separates over 200,000 children every year, just like those children at the border. And we know, not just because we saw it on TV, we know that research for decades has shown that forcibly separating children from their parents, whether it's through immigration enforcement, whether it's through parental incarceration, or whether it's through separation from the family policing system, is significantly associated with things like cognitive problems, aggression, poor educational achievement, and physical health consequences like hypertension or high blood pressure, difficulty sleeping, obesity, diabetes. So the act of separation itself causes harm. And then we know that after separation, children who spend time in foster care are significantly more likely to experience a host of adverse outcomes in foster care. Children who spend time in foster care compared to children who have experienced similar forms of maltreatment but don't go into foster care have 2 to 3 times higher delinquency rates, higher teen birth rates, lower earnings as adults, twice as likely to have learning disabilities, more likely to have behavioral problems, substance-related disorders, bipolar disorders, and arrest rates 2 or 3 times higher and more likely to have criminal convictions for violent offenses because of foster care, because of what foster care does to children. Now, it's important to mention here that these outcomes for foster care can happen to all children that enter foster care. Foster care is bad for everybody who enters foster care. Family separation is bad for everyone who enters foster care. The difference here is that Black children in America are already at poor risk over the course of, or poor outcomes over the course of their lives because of the daily experience of racism that they have to endure. Black children are already more likely to experience economic hardship, poor health, low educational attainment, teen births, criminal legal system involvement. When you then take this vulnerable population and then add the trauma of forced separation and placement in foster care, the risk of experiencing those outcomes is increased. The important point that I want to get across here is the child welfare system or the family policing system knows that it's causing these outcomes to children. The child welfare system knows the outcomes of foster care. It knows that it's causing these outcomes disproportionately to Black children and families, and it's choosing to do nothing about that. I believe that because of the history of the system, because of its intentional choice to do nothing to rectify these poor outcomes, the system is essentially an agent of oppression. It knows these outcomes are going to occur disproportionately for Black children, and the system does that anyways. So I think it's time for social work to consider some questions about this system and our place in this system. Can a system that began with a racist intent evolve into a system that achieves racial equity? Can decades of racist policies be revised to no longer produce racist outcomes? And I think importantly, is racial equity an appropriate goal for a system that produces harm? And that's what we have right now. If you're involved with the family policing system or paying attention to what's happening at the national level, you know that the current goal of the system is racial equity. The new commissioner, Asia Schomburg, talks about the importance of racial equity all the time. And the system believes that if they were to achieve racial equity, then that would solve their problem. And that makes sense if you think about disproportionality. So if disproportionality is a problem because of overrepresentation of Black children, then the solution is proportional representation, right? That kind of makes logical sense. Proportional representation is racial equity. But think about what that would mean if the system were to achieve racial equity. That means that hundreds of thousands of children would continue to be forcibly separated from their families. Those separations would just be distributed equitably by race. But given what we know about the harm of child welfare intervention, all that would result in would be equitable harm. And equitable harm is still harm. When you have a system that is fundamentally entrenched in harm, producing racial equity or equitable harm cannot be the solution. But that's the state of the field right now. And that is the policy goal that right now the social work as a profession is supporting. Which leads us to the up-in movement and why I and many others think we need to be thinking about this differently. So why up in the system? Because of everything that we just talked about. Decades of research have shown not only the existence of disproportionality, but also the extreme harm that results from disproportionality on Black children and families. And despite decades of reforms, literally, again, the system is not unaware of this problem. The system has been allegedly attempting to reform this problem for decades and has been unable to do anything about it. And that's because the system was designed to produce these outcomes. As I mentioned, ever since slavery was abolished, government systems have worked together to maintain the subjugation of Black Americans and the supremacy of white Americans, to maintain the supremacy that this country was literally founded on. The child welfare system is just one part of that, but it is acting concurrently with all of the other systems that came out of slavery, the policing, prisons, primary among them, to maintain the subjugation of Black Americans to ensure that white people stay at the top. So the system cannot be reformed because it was designed to keep Black families oppressed. So Upend is an emerging collaborative movement aimed at two concurrent goals: ending the use of involuntary separation of children from their families, and simultaneously increasing meaningful supports so families and communities can care for their children. Essentially, what we're trying to do is rethink state-sanctioned separation as a response to things that are really social problems, things like food insecurity, poverty, lack of affordable and safe housing, lack of prevention services. We know right now that nearly 70% of children who are forcibly separated from their parents are forcibly separated because of reasons related to poverty. Only 17% of children in foster care right now are in foster care because of what the system calls physical or sexual abuse. This is not a system that's responding to harm. This is a system that's separating children from their families because of poverty. We think we can address those issues in different ways, not through forcible separation. So I want to be really clear by what abolition means. And abolition means what many of you probably think. We mean the complete elimination of the existing child welfare system, which is built on this model of surveillance and separation, and not replacing it with another system, fundamentally recreating society in ways that think differently about how we care for children and families and communities. So that what we really have is a society where a child welfare system would be obsolete because children, families, communities have everything they need to live and thrive in their homes and communities. So abolition does not mean abandoning the need to care for children. If you hear our critics talk about abolition, they intentionally misunderstand abolition to say that if we abolish the system, then children are going to be just harmed and nobody's going to protect them. That's not what we're talking about at all. We're talking about protecting children before they ever have to be involved in a system that causes harm to them. So we're talking about new ways of protecting and supporting families in ways that don't involve things like surveillance and punishment. And we can do that. So if you think about abolition, what it really means, or when I think about abolition, I always think about this quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who says, importantly, abolition is about presence, not absence. Often many people think about the tearing down part of abolition and not the building up part. Abolition is much more about building something new than it is about tearing something down. But what I really like that she often says is that abolition is a way of seeing. She says, abolition makes you ask, when you look, what are you seeing? And what would you rather see? When I look at the child welfare system now, I see a system that disproportionately surveils Black bodies. I see a system that disproportionately separates Black children from their families. And I see a system that responds to societal problems like poverty and houselessness by punishing individuals for those problems. What I would rather see is a society where children have everything that they need to live and thrive in their homes and communities. Think again about the statistic I said that close to 70% of children are in foster care because of reasons related to poverty. What we have is a system that takes children away from their parents because of reasons largely related to poverty, and then we put those children in a home with a stranger that the system calls foster parents. And then we literally pay those strangers money to take care of someone else's children, when all those children's parents need is money. In the state of Texas, we pay foster parents an average of about $900 a month to take care of someone else's children. What if we gave that $900 a month to the mother who's struggling to meet her children's needs? We wouldn't need a child welfare system. That's what abolition is really about. And now I want to spend these last few minutes talking about the role of social work and where social work stands in all of this. First, it's important to look at an update in the 2021 Code of Ethics, the NASW Code of Ethics, where the Code of Ethics was updated to say social workers must take action. And this is the only place in the entire Code of Ethics that uses the word must. Social workers must take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. That's fairly straightforward, right? We need to be taking action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. To me, that means we need to be taking action against the systems that are responsible for oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities, of which the child welfare system is one of those. But then NASW says in Social Work Speaks, their policy statements, effective services to children and families and child welfare demand the values, knowledge, and skills that are intrinsic to social work education. Therefore, a BSW degree is recommended as the minimum requirement for child welfare workers. An MSW degree is recommended at child welfare supervisory and administrative levels. So we have NASW saying social workers must take action against oppression, racism, and discrimination and inequities, but then calling for 100% of the child welfare workforce to be social workers. Those two positions cannot exist at the same time. Some of you may be thinking, oh, but if there were more social workers in the system, then there would be less harm or less children would be removed. One, we've been trying that for 50 years and it hasn't turned out to be successful. Two, there is absolutely no evidence that social workers working in child welfare system result in better outcomes for children. People will tell you that there is, but there's not. There is research that will show that social workers working in child welfare systems leads to less burnout, less turnover, greater job satisfaction. There is no evidence that shows that social workers working in child welfare systems results in better outcomes for children. So NASW can't simultaneously say we need to take action against oppression and racism, and we need to work in the family policing system. Those two positions cannot exist at the same time. That's the problem that exists in social work right now. Another problem that exists in the social work profession is the fact that over the past several years, social work has, in NASW specifically, which oftentimes is held up to be the profession, has turned into what's largely an organization that makes performative statements with nothing behind them. In June 2021, NASW issued what many people call their apology statement, as many other social service organizations did, in a report called Undoing Racism Through Social Work. And what they said in this report is, despite visible leadership in our nation's most important social justice movements, the social work profession has also contributed to ongoing discrimination and oppression of people of color through its systems, policies, and practices. And one of the most persistent challenges to anti-racist practice in social work is disproportionate impact of the child welfare system on families of color. So social work here is acknowledging its historic role in contributing to harmful racism, discrimination, oppression against people of color. In the next page of that document, they say in bold, all capital letters, this is unacceptable and we need to make amends. The report then does not go on to describe in any way what those amends will be. And more importantly, the report does not commit to ending harm. Any of you who are listening who know anything about accountability processes, acknowledging harm is important. Apologizing for harm is important. But acknowledging harm and apologizing for harm without a commitment to stop doing that harm is meaningless. And NASW has not committed to ending that harm. In fact, they're calling for more social workers to be complicit in that harm. So if anyone from NASW is listening, your apology is meaningless, because an apology for harms without a commitment to stop engaging in those harms means nothing. Back to the Code of Ethics, just as a reminder, so social workers must take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. In June 2020, and remember what was happening in June 2020, here's what social work, the National Association of Social Workers had to say about social workers and policing. Social workers already work alongside and in partnership with police departments across the nation. Strengthening social worker and police partnerships can be an effective strategy in addressing behavioral health, mental health, substance use, homelessness, family disputes, and other similar calls to 911 emergency response lines. In fact, social workers are placing an increasingly integral role in police forces, helping officers do their jobs more effectively and humanely, and becoming better attuned attuned to cultural and racial biases. And studies show social workers help police excel in fulfilling their mission to protect and serve. Again, just a reminder, I don't have to remind you what was happening in June 2020. You know what was happening in June 2020. And you know the conversations that people were having about policing and violence in policing and racist violence in policing. If there was ever a moment in our history for NASW to take a stand against policing, June 2020 was that moment. And what our professional organization chose to do was to stand side by side with the police, embracing our partnerships with the police and calling for more of that. So when I see the profession say in their code of ethics that social workers need to take action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities, I read that as an entirely performative statement that really, I believe, embarrasses the profession and puts the profession at a place where we're at a point where if we don't make some critical changes, are going to come to a place where we lose entire credibility. Because anyone who knows what social workers do in actual practice knows that social workers are not taking action against oppression, racism, discrimination, and inequities. We're complicit in those things. So several social workers in summer 2020 and since then have advocated for something different. In an open letter to NASW, we called for several action items, and I'll close with these because NASW and the larger profession of social work still hasn't done any of these things. We've asked NASW to publicly endorse the Black Lives Matter petition to defund the police. We've asked them to craft a position statement on the divestment and reinvestment of law enforcement budgets to go to communities. We've asked for a public comment from members of NASW and allied organizations to add a code about racial justice, to take seriously calls about abolition, and to recognize social work's historical role in perpetuating anti-Blackness and in regulating the lives of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous families. And then we also called on some things for schools of social work. So if you're in a school of social work, if you're in a position of power, this is what I and some others believe we should be doing. Discontinuing field placements in programs that uphold the prison industrial complex, such as probation offices, jails, and others. We've done this at my school, so it's possible to do. Support your faculty in creating events or other learning opportunities to discuss how social work can move forward outside of the criminal legal system, family policing system. Learn more about the harms of carceral systems, and encourage students to think critically about our role in these spaces. Social work, because of our commitment, we should be at the forefront of abolitionist movements. Because of our commitment to social justice, racial justice, we should be leading abolitionist efforts, but we're not. And that's an intentional decision that the leaders of our profession are making. What's important to point out here, and then I'll close, we are the social work profession. Individuals are the social work profession. If we stopped paying NASW membership dues, they would go out of business. So those of us who think that we need to be doing more to change the direction of the system, we need to be the ones who are uniting and demanding change. We can do that by withdrawing our memberships, and we can do that by rising up collectively against the people who are making these decisions on our behalf, and saying that they represent the profession, because they don't. We do. And those of us who want a code of ethics to be more than just a performative document, we have the power to change that. So I encourage all of you to resist, rise up, demand something better. Happy to take some questions now. If you want to learn more about this, I tweet about family policing and the harms of carceral system and all of the problems with social work a lot. So follow me on Twitter, and I love to engage with people on Twitter. And now I'm very happy to take some questions and hear from our respondents.
I'm gonna wait one more minute for Dawn to come jump back in so she can introduce the reflectors. If not, I can go ahead and jump in. So let me wait a couple more seconds for Dawn. If not, I can jump in. Okay, I'll just go. Okay, so I'm going to introduce our student reflector, Noor. Noor is our doctoral candidate at BU School of Social Work and a Ford Foundation doctoral dissertation fellow. Her research draws from social, legal, and developmental frameworks to understand Black, Indigenous, and youth of color and young adults' experiences in the United States child welfare, juvenile, and criminal legal system. She investigates the experiences of youth transitioning into, between, and out of state agencies and how these transitions shape their development and future life trajectories. Noor's research and teaching are also focused on racial justice, community engaged research methods, and youth participatory action research and abolitionist theory and practice. I'm going to pass it to Noor.
Thank you, Rihanna. Thank you for that. And thank you, Dean Dettlaff, so much for your incredibly informative talk, as well as the rest of the body of your work on abolition and the child welfare system and the family regulation system. I think that one of the most valuable dimensions of the abolitionist critique of the family regulation system is in highlighting the ways that the logic of carceral systems is not just limited to prisons and police alone. And you've extensively discussed how the family regulation system has historically been and continues to be a way of managing, surveilling, and controlling children and families, especially in communities of color. And I think this analysis can be very surprising to a lot of people. Like the abolitionist critics of the school to prison pipeline, these kinds of frames can help us see the potential for carceral processes, practices, logics to manifest across a lot of systems, right? Not just jails, prisons, and policing. As well as the ways that these systems reinforce each other. So my question is, what do you think right now are the most important targets? And by that, I mean laws, problems, spaces, campaigns for organizers, educators, and researchers to focus their resources on right now in their effort to roll back the family regulation system?
Thanks, Nor. Great question. Yeah, absolutely. I think the most important place where we should be targeting our efforts right now is on repealing CAPTA. CAPTA is the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and CAPTA is the federal act that mandates reporting of a suspected child abuse in every state. So every state has their own laws that require mandatory reporting, but that each of those state laws come from the federal law that essentially mandates that every state has their own law. And every state has their own law, and then every state has definitions of maltreatment that vary widely across states. A really good example to help people understand how much variation there is and how much subjectivity there is what happened in Texas recently, where the governor decided that providing gender-affirming care to transgender children is child abuse. That's how these mandatory reporting laws can be weaponized. So in Texas, providing gender-affirming care to a child is child abuse because one white man said so. It's not child abuse anywhere else. That's the problem with mandatory reporting laws. The other problem is mandatory reporting laws are so vague that people think that they have to report any minor suspicion or they will be at risk of losing their job, losing their license. So, and most people believe, because the system itself has done a really good propaganda campaign to create this perception, most people believe that if they report someone to Child Protective Services, that child will get some form of help. They won't. The child welfare system has no resources to help children meet their actual needs, particularly if those needs are related to poverty. If you refer someone to the child welfare system because they're hungry, the child welfare system isn't going to give them money for food. If you refer someone to the child welfare system because they're homeless, the child welfare system isn't going to give them money to get an apartment. That's not what that system does. But because of these incredibly vague laws, people think they have to report children to the system. And once you're in the system, the racism and the oppression that's built within that system overtake the family, and they get sucked in and sucked in and sucked in. So it starts with eliminating mandatory reporting. You're in.
Thank you, Alan. I'd like to introduce our next reflector, Maya Milik. They use they pronouns, is a social worker in the Boston area. They're an adjunct faculty at BUSSW and an alum from the program. They're currently working with the City School and Boston Liberation Health to facilitate a community-led design process of mental health crisis response program in Boston that does not involve law enforcement. They're also engaged in local abolitionist organizing, including working with Boston Immigrant Justice Accompaniment Network to support undocumented folks, and with Deeper Than Water to organize against medical and mental health neglect and abuse within the prisons.
Thank you, Dawn, and thank you so much, Alan. I'm really grateful that you're here, and especially for all your work and all the work of UpM to abolish this harmful system. My personal experience has been that over the past year or so, there have been comparatively more of these conversations about the harms of the system, but still this topic is really not talked about nearly enough, both in courses and in the field of social work generally. So again, sort of really appreciate you being here. And as I was listening, I sort of found myself reflecting on how your analysis is so deeply informed by your own experiences working within the system. And so relatedly, really appreciate your honesty and directness, including about NASW, but also just your honesty about your prior complicity in the system. And also just find myself reflecting on the strong connections that you draw between all the systems of harm on so many levels, and just sort of sitting here reflecting on one of those connections about how you talked about families being separated in the border and families being separated during slavery, and also obviously during separated through the system. And so just really appreciate your deep analysis of these similar oppressive practices and how they're also deeply embedded in a racist system. So one question I would love to hear more about is, you talked a lot about the sort of challenges of the system, but would love to hear more about any sort of wins or successes that the UpM movement has had, or just sort of the movement to abolish the system in general.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that the successes that we've had, UpM launched in June 2020. And I think the successes that we've had are something that you kind of alluded to, the conversations that are happening in social work spaces now. The fact that I'm invited to a school like Boston University to talk about abolishing this system, that for the most of the general public, the child welfare system is synonymous with what social work is. It's our very identity in many ways. So just that this conversation is happening in social work schools to the extent that it's happening, I think is a huge win. I just saw an article that was published a couple days ago. I can't remember the source. I think it might have been The Guardian, but they used the term family separations to talk about a problem in a child welfare system. And using that language, family separation, is new to this field, because that's the term that kind of became, that was the term that was used on the separations that were done at the border. several years ago, family separations, and it was the family separation policy. People didn't used to talk about the child welfare system doing family separations. The system itself gave us the term removal, which is completely devoid of any concept of trauma or harm. But so just that the media are now starting to use the idea of family separations, I think is a huge win, because much of what Upend's tried to do over the last couple of years has been to change the narrative about the system. We ultimately want to change policies. We ultimately want to repeal CAPTA, ASFA, things like that in family separations entirely. But we also recognize that the system has done a very good job of creating a myth of benevolence. And in order to change policy, there has to be political will to do that. And there's not going to be political will to do that until there is mass outrage over what's happening. And that's the goal of the Upend movement. And it's actually, that was the family separations were the catalyst that turned white Northerners in the 1800s into slavery abolitionists, recognizing how horrific family separations were, that children were being taken from their mothers, sold off to other people. That understanding of just the visceral harm of separating babies from their mothers is what launched the abolition movement in the 1840s, 1850s. If we could recreate that today, that's what could really turn the tide toward abolishing the system.
Thank you so much, Dean Dettlaff and Maya. I'd like to introduce our third reflector, Linda Sprague-Martinez. Is an associate professor and former chair of the macro department at Boston University School of Social Work. She is interested in examining asset-based strategies to tackle health inequities. As such, community-engaged research approaches like community-based participatory research and youth-led participatory research are central to her work. Having formerly worked in municipal and state government and as an adolescent mental health provider, she brings practical expertise in community collaborations designed to engage diverse communities of color and low-income residents in community planning and intervention development.
Great. Thanks so much, Dawn. And thank you so much, Dean Dettlaff, for your presentation. It's such a powerful talk on an important topic. I really appreciated your starting out with your own personal experience around complicity, because we're all so complicit in these systems at times that it's hard to kind of separate and step back and really see them. But once you do, it's hard to look back, right? Once you realize that the system is not broken, that the system, as you note, is really designed to maintain the status quo. And in this case, the subjugation of Black people and the forced labor, and how it's so entwined with our capitalist economy, and that we need it in place, is powerful. And I also really appreciated the analogy you gave around equity, because we hear a lot of those, sorry, I'm moving my hands, the buzzwords around equity. We want to achieve equity. And in this case, equity is so harmful. And in most cases, even I do work in health, around health and health equity. And sometimes we don't, when we're talking about equity, we're not talking about racism. We're not talking, in this case, as you are talking about, is anti-Black racism. And so as you were talking, I was thinking about social work and social workers, and how social workers are embedded in all of this, across all of the systems that you're describing that are so interconnected. That we're embedded in child welfare system, we're embedded in healthcare system, which is also very carceral and not always caring, embedded in criminal justice system, and now as we know, the whole co-responder model with that you described as well. And so how do we, I guess my question for you is, as schools of social work, how do we work together? Because I think sometimes the system has us in competition with one another, right? And it's designed for us to not be talking the same language. How do we move forward? What are some successes you've had in really rethinking curriculum? How do we make sure that we're not training folks to go into systems and be complicit, but to really be thinking about the new world that we want to see, where we want to live, where we want to raise our families? And how do we kind of prepare students for that, to go into the systems to make change? And then how do we, as schools of social work, I'm thinking from your position as dean, really start to organize ourselves and work together? You know, if the NASW is not working for us, then maybe we need to really rethink these things. So all of that, I'm just going to throw all that at you and you go with it. So.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Linda. You know, I never view schools of social work in competition with each other. I don't think that's the issue. I think the larger problem is that there is not agreement within social work about this particular issue, which, you know, it is unusual in some respects, because if you think about it, social workers tend to align around positions, even what are considered, you know, hot button controversial political topics, things like reproductive justice, things like LGBTQ equality, all of those things. Social workers are all on board with that. Social workers do not share a collective opinion or identity about this particular issue when it comes to policing by the police, by the family policing system. And I think that's the barrier that we really need to tackle, because we're not united in this. I think that's largely because of issues of anti-Black racism. I think that's largely because of fear of speaking out about what remains a controversial issue. I think that, you know, deans of social work schools have a responsibility to speak up more. I've heard other deans have said to me that they agree with me, but they're afraid to say so because of some consequence. That is not a leader to me. A leader needs to be able to say the things that need to be said, regardless of what the consequences are. And really, when you think about it, we're all in such incredibly privileged positions. If my provost were to decide to remove me as dean tomorrow, I'm still a full professor with tenure. I mean, it's not like I would entirely lose my job. I mean, we're not, it's not that much of a risk, you know. So deans of social work schools need to start standing up and saying what needs to be said and coming out against NASW and all of these things. I think that's where the real lack of unity is. It's not that schools are competitive, it's that we can't come to an agreement about this issue.
Thank you, Linda and Dean Detloff. Wow, there's so much to say and so many questions. We just have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So I'm just gonna there's a lot of them here, but I'm just gonna ask you one at a time. The first one comes from one of our MSW students, so I'm going to privilege that question, to privilege a student question and ask you, Dean Detloff, do you have any recommendations for those of us in MSW programs when working with faculty and professors who are staunchly anti-abolition?
Yeah, absolutely. Just start by challenging them. Challenge them and say that while they personally can have that position, that it's the responsibility of a professor to know what social movements are happening that impact social workers, and to be able to educate students about those social movements. So being anti-abolitionist or being against abolition as a professor, as a person, is not an excuse to not teach about the value and the goals of abolition in social work classes, because that's what students want to learn about. It's also important to point out that within social work, this is anecdotal, but there's an enormous generational difference here on this particular issue. My students are probably 80–90% abolitionists. I mean, in some ways, that's why they come here, but it's just part of the younger generation of social workers that understand this issue much differently than people my age and older understand it. So faculty need to understand that social work students want to learn about abolition. They want to be abolition, and professors are they're not doing their job if they're not teaching about that.
Thank you. Someone asked, what will take the place of the social welfare? I'm assuming they mean the child protection system. What will take the place is the question.
You know, that's such an interesting concept that people ask about all the time. You know, Mariam Kaba, who's a very well-known and brilliant prison abolitionist, talks about this as being the phenomenon of the somewhere else. So if children aren't in foster care, where will they go? If rapists aren't in prison, where will they go? And other people, you know, the challenge to that is, what, this is going to sound radical, but what if the answer was just nothing? What if we replaced it with nothing? Meaning that we wouldn't need another place for people to go because they have everything that they need to live, thrive in their homes and communities. So the solution is not replacing it with another system. The solution is, well, I mean, the big solution is ending capitalism, obviously, which, but in lieu, until we get to that place, the big position, I know somebody put in the chat something about the social welfare system, and that kind of is the solution. It is the government's responsibility to ensure that people who live in this country are not living in poverty. It's the government's responsibility to ensure that people have homes. And those are easily solvable problems. It is a choice of the government to allow poverty to continue. It's a choice of the government to allow people to live unhoused. We can make different policy decisions to address that. So that's what can replace the child welfare system, a better government that meets the needs of the people who live in this country.
Amazing. And our final question for the night, which I think sort of you kind of started to answer, but what can we do to resist? And I like the word resist because you used the same word in your talk, on a local level and in day-to-day interactions with the family policing system as social workers.
Yeah, great question to end on. You know, I think so. The first step is, as I mentioned, you know, making decisions to extricate ourselves from these systems that cause harm. I know not everybody can just quit your job tomorrow, but I think it should be for every social worker who is complicit in harm needs to be taking steps toward ending their complicity in that harm to the extent that we can. I think, you know, related to that is the idea of, so every individual social worker coming to the point where we recognize that change from the inside is a lie that white people have been telling us for decades that is just simply not true. We kind of appease ourselves by saying, well, if we're not working in this system, my clients would experience much worse outcomes, or people will say, well, I need to be in the system because I'm doing really good things for my clients and I'm helping them. What I'll say to that is that during times of slavery, people who had slaves would often say, but I take really good care of my slaves. That's the equivalent to what people are saying now when we say, but I need to work in these systems to help these people. You're not helping them. And even if you're providing help to those individual people, it's not about that. It's not changing the system. But the white people who run society, run these organizations, want us to believe that we can change things from the inside, so we'll stay. We need to reject that logic and get out of these systems and start working from the outside to end them. We will never end them from the inside.
Wow, that was fire. I want to thank you so much, Dean Detloff, for giving us so much to think about the family policing system and how it touches each area of each department in our school, clinical, macro, policy, and how we can think about you know, what we can do in our curriculum, in our conversations with students. I want to thank you so much for coming, our insightful reflectors, Noor, Maya, and Linda Sprague Martinez, our amazing behind the scenes research assistants, Rihanna and Ashley, and our friend that was doing the interpretation as well, the transcription. One more reminder that if you're getting CEUs, you must complete the form. And Rihanna is just going to put that link in the chat, or you need to sort of just click on that link, complete the evaluation form, and then we'll get you the CEU certificate. In the movement, we like to say that the path to justice is more like a marathon and not a sprint. So we say, take good care of yourselves, everyone, because we need all of you, all of us, to create the new world that we all deserve. We hope to see you at our next E&I speakers event on Thursday, October 27th, when Tara Venkatraman and Amaltala Mervin from the City School will present on community organizing and political education, impacts on the mental health for BIPOC youth. Our wonderful faculty colleague, Dr. Linda Sprague Martinez, will moderate this session. Thanks everyone for so much for coming. Another special thank you to Dean Dettlaff, and onward in the journey for our collective liberation.
Thank you. It was great to be with you all tonight.